Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 39, Sir Francis Drake's Ghost. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome new members of the House of Lords. Earl Vaughan Radermeyer, Earl Keay, Earl Julian O'Connor, Countess Andrea Olafson, Earl Ian Needs, Earl Frank Blackburn, and Earl Brett Wooldridge. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Last time, we covered the arrival in the Caribbean of the fleet of the Western Design. This was Oliver Cromwell's bid for empire, as the historian Carla Pestana termed it. This was by far the greatest single military adventure of any British state by this point. Dozens of warships, along with thousands of soldiers and sailors, were dispatched to the other side of the world, with the expectation that the English colonies they found there would give them supplies and recruits. Cromwell had sent them to seize the Spanish Empire's Caribbean colonies. The ships had arrived at Barbados, where they'd seriously worn out their welcome, before they sailed on to the other English settlements in the Lesser Antilles. They reached Montserrat, where they picked up more troops and supplies, and then set sail for their first target, the first domino which would surely fall. As we saw last time, it was up to the commissioners, William Penn, Robert Venables, Daniel Searle, and Edward Winslow, to decide on their exact target. The island of Cuba and the South American port city of Cartagena were considered, but after gathering local information, the leadership decided that the island of Hispaniola would be their destination. Their exact reasons for picking Hispaniola were helpfully recorded by Penn's secretary, helpfully sent on a ship back to England, and then unhelpfully lost at some point in the last 3.5 centuries. But we do know that the defences of Havana and the fleet's distance from Cartagena ruled out those targets. As the expedition was still waiting for its supply ships, which also carried the bulk of their artillery, the relative vulnerability of Hispaniola's capital city, Santo Domingo, made it a sensible choice. The fleet sailed northwesterly from Montserrat and passed by the island colony of Puerto Rico. The expedition didn't attempt to conquer the island, but it did try to get more information. One of their frigates replaced the flag of the Commonwealth with a Spanish ensign, and then sailed into the harbour of San Juan. Then this Spanish ship would signal the harbour that it needed a local pilot to guide it into port. When the pilot arrived, he would be kidnapped and interrogated for information. Fortunately for the pilot, the Spanish didn't fall for the trick, and the expedition had to move on. But this failure didn't mean that the English were without guides. The fleet had picked up 4 men with local knowledge. We know very little about 2 of them, and they don't appear to have had much of an impact on the expedition, so they won't be on the test. But the other 2 men are a different story. One was Kemp Saibada, a Frisian pilot who had been sailing the Caribbean since at least 1640. He was well known to the Caribbean English, first serving the Providence Island colony, and then after the English were expelled, he made his way around the New World, settling in New England, but regularly sailing back to the Caribbean to trade. This included trade with the Spanish colonies, who were, just like the English, loath to turn away profitable traders, no matter what the metropolitan government decreed. He was in Antigua when the fleet found him, and he joined up. The other major figure was Captain Christopher Cox. Cox claimed to have served the Spanish as an artilleryman in colonial forts for 12 years, and he boasted a vast knowledge of the region and its military defences. His background is a bit of a mystery. Either he was an Irish Catholic, or the Spanish believed he was an Irish Catholic. If he was Irish, historians like Pestana speculate that he might have already been in the Caribbean in 1642, and then fled when the news of the atrocities of the Irish Rebellion reached the colonies. Though if this was the case, she does suggest that this would make it surprising when the design's leaders trusted him. But they did. The fleet was nearly at Hispaniola when the leadership decided they had to tell their officers an unpleasant piece of news. The vast majority of the people on the Western design had been brought on the mission without any real warning or choice, and certainly no information. They had finally learned where they were going to attack after weeks of mystery, and this had presented a silver lining. Spain was fabulously wealthy. Everyone knew that. The Spanish colonies were the source of that wealth. Everyone was telling them how undefended they were, how lazy the Spanish garrisons would be, how easily the conquest would come. So the soldiers of the design had assumed that they were on course for an extravagant payday. Plunder was the soldiers' reward on every other foreign campaign any of them had fought. But cast your minds back to our first episode on the design. The Lord Protector had outright forbidden any private looting on this expedition. Everything the Western design conquered, plundered, or looted was to be used by the state. The commissioners would be in charge of cataloguing all the vast wealth that was surely about to fall into English hands and use it to further the design. Needless to say, the soldiers were not pleased by this news, not pleased at all. Many of them simply did not believe that this was Oliver Cromwell's doing. He was a soldier, he understood them, and he'd never deny them their just rewards. The officers were just as outraged as their men, and they complained bitterly to the commissioners that they'd been promised free plunder by Cromwell, and if they'd been told that this wasn't possible, they'd never have come. Many blamed Winslow. He wasn't a soldier. He was a civilian. This was all his doing. And in a certain way, they did have a point. Faced with the outrage of the soldiers, Penn and Venables, both military men who sympathised with the soldiers' reaction and worried about its effects on morale, were tempted to give in and ignore Cromwell's decree. But Winslow kept them in line after days of debate. The anti-plunder decree would stand. As Pestana neatly puts it, quote, "The reception of this order, like the seaman's objection to the restriction on prize money, hinted that any hopes of making imperial expansion self-financing faced serious obstacles. Poor men had no intention of funding empire out of their own pockets." The matter was settled just in time. On the 12th of April, the fleet caught its first sight of Hispaniola. The next day, they saw the capital of Santo Domingo, and the Spanish saw them. It was a formidable, terrifying sight. 60 ships, 56 of them massive warships, was certainly the largest naval force the English had ever sent to the Caribbean. The Spanish weren't caught completely unprepared. As we've seen, there was no hiding the preparations for the Western design, and Madrid realised that their colonial empire was a likely target. A new governor of Hispaniola had arrived only 2 weeks earlier. The Conde de Peñalva had brought with him 200 more troops, arquebusiers, to protect the island, just in case his new jurisdiction drew the short straw, and a fleet of English warships arrived off his coast. Well, a fleet of English warships had arrived off his coast, and the Spanish sprung into action. The militia and professional soldiers mustered to the sounds of drums, and the city's armoury was broken open. Spears, muskets, and arquebuses were handed out, and the defenders prepared for an immediate attack. They needn't have rushed. The English fleet sailed west, aiming to disembark their ground forces in the same spot which Sir Francis Drake had in 1586. When they reached this point, about 7 miles to the west of Santo Domingo, near the mouth of the River Haina, the admirals discovered that the surf was too rough for the landing boats. Deciding that it was better to act rather than wait for conditions to improve, because who knew how long that would take, the fleet kept moving west. They finally found a safe place to disembark, Point Nicao, 30 miles away from Santo Domingo. One of the accounts which survive from the design fleet by one Henry Whistler suggests that it was always the plan to land 30 miles from the city. This is most likely a fib, but land they did. 7,500 soldiers disembarked in good order at Point Nikeo. 6.5 regiments of foot, along with troops of cavalry. There was no one to contest their landing because, again, the defenders were 30 miles away. A Spanish fisherman witnessed the invasion and managed to get away, sailing back to Santo Domingo to inform the governor. Those 7,500 men landed under the command of Robert Venables, but they weren't the full contingent of troops. Penn led a few ships back east, which tried to land their soldiers at a part of the coast the Spanish called Cocido, only a few miles east of Santo Domingo. But this was simply not going to happen. Spanish sources describe this region as, quote, full of rocks and very sharp terrain, end quote. There was nowhere that a ship of any decent size could get close to the shore without risking wreck, and so Penn called it off. This part of the fleet anchored offshore, and the following day they sailed back to the western side of Santo Domingo, where they managed to land their smaller force at the mouth of the Rio Jaena, pretty much where they'd originally tried to land the previous day. Santo Domingo sits on Hispaniola's southern coast, and 2 groups of British soldiers were now to its west. The larger portion, about 30 miles from the city, and the smaller one, about 12 miles from the city. This had really not been the plan. Instead of converging on Santo Domingo from both sides, with forces only a few miles from the city's land walls on the west and the Ozama River on the east, the smaller force would have to wait for the rest of the army to meet them. That larger force, 30 miles away from the city and about 18 from the reinforcements, had landed with enough supplies to last for 3 days of marching. This was less than soldiers had carried during their campaigns in Ireland, but giving them any more would have stretched the fleet's provisions. But besides any logistical demands, more than 3 days of rations was considered unnecessary. 30 miles wasn't that far, and the officers estimated that they would reach Santo Domingo in 2 to 3 days. The city itself would be easy to capture, they all assumed, because once again this expedition was haunted by Sir Francis Drake's ghost. He had captured Santo Domingo in a single day, so naturally this larger, more professional force could do that too. Of course, it wasn't going to be that simple, and the leadership should have recognised this before they even began marching. Landing 7,500 men was not a quick or easy thing to do, and some soldiers had already eaten half their rations before the march even began at 4 p.m. on the 14th of April. A day and a half of rations, to last a journey of at least 2. Well, surely the army could feed itself as it marched. And march they did. The first night, a small mounted Spanish force skirmished with the army's vanguard before withdrawing, and the soldiers made camp on a large plain or savanna. There was a cowherd's house here, and it was soon on fire. The following day, Venable's force marched through more savannas, watched by Spanish scouts and colonists, who burned the pastures in the English path and drove away any livestock which the invaders might eat. As the army followed the coast east and north, they had to travel through woods and hills. Despite this, they managed to march 18 miles in a single day. At one point, the column was ambushed by the Spanish, but the defenders withdrew without causing much damage. And yet the invaders were harassed by skirmishers all day. Several were picked off from the tree line, and one of the English horsemen outright disappeared, and his comrades had no idea where he'd gone. The Spanish knew, because they'd nabbed him. The cavalryman sang like a canary, and through him the defenders learned of English goals on the island, that this was conquest, and not a raid in force. But he also gave them the impression that this was a joint Anglo-Dutch invasion, an alliance of Protestants against a Catholic empire. It was nothing of the sort, of course, but it worried the Spanish. After that second long day, the army made camp in an abandoned plantation, and it was around this time that the main weakness in the design's planning became impossible to ignore, as soldiers began to die. Water. Despite the warnings of Thomas Modiford, the planners of the Western design had not realised how essential this would be. The military commissioners were used to fighting in Britain and Ireland, where the weather can be many things, but usually wet. Soldiers rarely carried water with them on a march, and instead drank from the wells, rivers and streams they passed. This had the downsides we might expect, with waterborne diseases of one kind or another ravaging the troops, but thirst rarely became an issue in itself. But this was not Britain and Ireland. As the Caribbean sun glared down on them, in the final weeks of Hispaniola's dry season, the British soldiers discovered how much they missed British weather. They marched past creeks and streams which had been dry for months, or which had a trickle of brackish, muddy water, or which lingered in stagnant pools. Parched soldiers drank what they could, but by the end of that second day, the army had already seen the first victims of dehydration pass out or die. There was little relief to be found in the wells they came across either. Spanish defenders poisoned or blocked up the wells of villages and plantations which they could reach before the invaders, and even those they couldn't were often already dry from the lack of groundwater. Venables later described this period in his report to the Lord Protector, quote, "We marched in a most sad and miserable manner, in an unknown country, tormented with heat, hunger, and thirst, myself enduring what the meanest suffered." End quote. The English did find some relief in this exotic climate. Fruit, specifically oranges, which grew along the road. But even this had its downsides. Soldiers who ate too many became sick, including with diarrhea, which dehydrated them even more. By the afternoon of the third day, the army had reached the River Haina, where they had meant to disembark 3 days before, and where they were expecting to rendezvous with the other force. Now closer to Santo Domingo, there were more signs of life. More villages and plantations around the city, which the army raided for any food, drink, or treasure which the evacuating inhabitants had left behind. They could finally quench their thirst from the river, and soon enough they spied an English soldier on the other side of the river. Someone swam across to speak with him to find out what had happened. The smaller force had been commanded by Colonels Anthony Buller and Richard Holdip. After landing the previous day, they'd spent the night near the Haina. In the morning, Buller decided to send an advance force towards a nearby fort, Fort Geronimo, to scout it out. Buller then ordered the whole party mobilized, and they marched on the fort. The soldier who informed Venables of this had been left behind because he was ill. Venables needed to follow Buller, but he was on the wrong side of the river. How he would get across was the question. His guides had no useful information about the Haina, and so Venables drew on his own experience of river crossings, which suggested that a bridge or ford would be upstream. But this experience had been made in Britain and Ireland, where rain was more or less year-round. In the Caribbean, with its largely seasonal rainfall, the mouth of the Haina was actually the best place to cross at this time of year. The reduced flow of the river meant that sand and silt had built up over the course of the dry season, and the push and pull of the river and the tide had created a sandbar across the mouth of the river. There was a temporary ford right there. Instead, Venables relied on his own experience and led his army up the river. The going was tough. Not only was it uphill, but there was thick vegetation and forest, and their pace slowed to a crawl. They also veered away from the path of the river until they emerged into another savanna. After just a few miles, they had to call a halt in this clearing, where the invaders went without food or water. As the infantry rested, Venables sent out scouts to find that river again and a way to cross it. They returned that night with good news. They'd found the river and a ford about 3 miles from the camp. 1,800 men were sent to take and hold the crossing, with the rest of the army to follow the next day. It was now Tuesday, and Venables' 4th day on Hispaniola. They began their march before sunrise and eventually made it to the ford and across the Heina, and then they turned south and back towards the estuary. They started to meet people who weren't shooting at them or trying to run away. One was an elderly Spaniard, who the English tried, and failed, to get information from. Another was an Irishman, who offered the English some assistance, which they begrudgingly and warily accepted. They were then joined by 2 Africans, and one of these spoke both English and Spanish. He explained he had once been the servant of Sir Thomas Warner, the original governor of the English colony of St. Kitts, before the Spanish had captured and enslaved him. He was willing to join the expedition and give what information he could. At 4 p.m, Venables got even more good news. They had found Buller and his men. The English army was now reunited. At which point, with things finally looking up, they walked right into an ambush. And when I say they, I mean the leaders of the army. Venables, his leading officers, the guide Christopher Cox, and their secretaries. They were in the advance guard as they approached what appeared to be an abandoned fort. This fort, San Geronimo, was not abandoned, and it was ready for them. One of the guards spotted a Spanish soldier lying in the undergrowth by the road. He took aim and fired. He was answered by a hail of gunfire from the rest of the enemy force, hidden from sight. The advance guard broke and fled, leaving between 20 and 30 men dead or wounded on the road. This included 4 officers, 2 secretaries, and the guide Cox. The panic of the rout spread. A contingent of firelock armed soldiers broke too, and so too did a group of reformados. Luckily for the rest of the army, these returning veterans rallied and held their ground, withstanding 3 volleys of gunfire which killed their captain before the ambushers retreated. The Spanish had been led by Colonel Juan Morfa, known to the English as a Catholic Irishman named Murphy. Venables himself came very close to death or capture. It was only because the Spanish hadn't realized he was the leader of the expedition, at the front, carrying a gun on his shoulder, that the general was able to slip away from the fighting, running through the trees until he could rejoin the bulk of the army down the road. This was probably the wisest course of action, but this incident would become a frequent charge of incompetence and cowardice by Venables' enemies. The sun was now setting, and the British attempted to hold their position on the road overnight. But Fort San Geronimo no longer needed to pretend to be empty, and so they bombarded them relentlessly with artillery until they finally admitted defeat at around midnight and withdrew back across the Heina. They returned to their original campsite on that plain and arrived in the wee hours of the morning. The army gorged itself on what sugarcane and oranges they'd found and slept until midday. After this lie-in, they marched back down the river, retracing their steps, where the fleet now waited for them. During a brief period where the surf quietened, supplies were shipped to shore, and the soldiers had food and drink, some of them for the first time in days. And here they stayed, from Wednesday until the following Monday, on half rations supplied by the fleet, which itself bombarded Santo Domingo's defences in repeated attacks. On the Friday, the Spanish attacked the English camp in a sally which left 7 or 8 dead, in exchange for 1 Englishman. The R&R the army received on this Caribbean beach was not one you'd recommend for a holiday. Though they now had better food and water, many had already become sick from the previous days of marching. Also, better food and water doesn't mean good food and water. Their food was terrible, as naval supplies infamously are, with the soldiers complaining about bad biscuit. And the water wasn't much better. The Heina was not a good river for drinking, and the water tastes like copper, apparently because it was full of copper. There was a mine upstream which contaminated the river, and the dry season meant it was even more concentrated. And speaking of contamination, we have thousands of men suffering from diarrhea, which one way or another ended up in the river, which was their drinking water. Yuck. And speaking of the dry season, it very suddenly ended. with a torrential downpour on an army which had no shelter. And all the while, the Spanish probed the camp with scouting parties. On the Tuesday, 11 days after Venables had landed, the expedition set off once again for Santo Domingo. It had hardly been a 5-star resort, but the army was at least a little bit recovered. They had enough food for 6 days at half rations, and the ships had delivered some small artillery pieces, mortars, which the army dragged with them. The pace was sluggish, only 2 miles by the end of the day. The fleet remained at the mouth of the river, ready to support the ground forces with artillery fire and siege ladders. But it was only by the afternoon of that Wednesday that English flags were visible near Fort San Geronimo. This time, they were prepared. The army moved forwards in formation up the wide road towards the fort, led by Adjutant General Jackson. Jackson had been ordered to send forces into the forests along the road, but for some reason he hadn't done so. The fort's cannons opened up on the advancing soldiers, filled not with round shot, but a rudimentary form of shrapnel or canister shot, sometimes termed scrap shot, and it was exactly what it sounded like. As one account recalled, quote, "The great fort guns loaded with small shot, bits of iron, broken pistol barrels, and all such mischief, had full power and sure aim all along that narrow pass." Then, from the same place as the week before, a force of Spanish lancers appeared in the forest. For some reason, this still took the English by surprise. The vanguard panicked and fired a volley, and then the horsemen charged before they could reload. The vanguard broke. They threw down their guns and ran, quote, "like a torrent in a narrow passage straitened, or a furious wave in a rough sea, nay, indeed, lightning, the whole forlorn tumbled into the Reformado." End quote. The forlorn hope, the vanguard, rushed into the men behind them, and only the veteran Reformados held their ground. Everyone else in the front of the column routed, leaving them alone and vastly outnumbered. 2/3 of them were killed, around 37, as they finally fell back. The routed soldiers flowed down the road, and the panic was contagious. All the while, the guns in the fort and the charging lancers killed and killed. One account described how the lancers, about 80 strong, quote, "killed until they were weary of killing, falling chiefly among the bravest of our men." Many different accounts use that phrase, "weary of killing," to describe the slaughter and why it eventually ended. Among the deaths were dozens of officers, 1 major, 4 captains and 5 ensigns. The greatest loss was Major General Healey, who stood and fought to the death, and who was a devastating loss for English morale. One of the Africans who had joined Venables in his first days on the island was killed as well, as were hundreds of rank-and-file soldiers. Most accounts of the disaster, it wasn't much of a battle, came from naval officers, and so nowhere near Fort San Geronimo, who wrote with disgust about the cowardice of the soldiers. Many of the dead were speared through the back, killed as they ran away. Those lancers had been known to the English. They called them cow-killers because these horsemen rode around the island hunting semi-wild cattle with spears. When news of the invasion had spread across the colony, many cow-killers rode to Santo Domingo to defend the island. Many were of African descent, some were even escaped slaves who fought in return for manumission. There had been a fair amount of grim delight when the English learned that they would be facing lances meant for killing cows. Let the lancers charge a line of muskets. Well, they had, and as they withdrew back up the road, they left a trail of hundreds of dead, and thousands of discarded muskets thrown to the ground by fleeing soldiers. Spanish estimates range from 700 to 1,500 killed. Furthering the humiliation for the army, between 8 and 9 of the regimental colours had been abandoned in the rout. To lose their colours was a source of immense shame for an early modern regiment. Worse, one English regiment, which had fought quite well, was from the Navy. A regiment of sailors, possibly marine veterans from the Anglo-Dutch War, had stood and fought, and even chased the Spanish as they retreated. That the navy had made it further to their target than the regular soldiers was an embarrassment. And even worse, it soon became known they'd lost to women. Most women had been evacuated from the city, along with children and priests, but several stayed and fought, with at least one serving as a captain. After the lancers retreated, the English seemed to rally. Part of the army moved back up the road to a forward position, as others tried to find a placement where the mortars could hit San Geronimo. At a council of war, Venables and his surviving officers debated what to do. Could they storm the fort? Should they bypass it and head straight for the city walls? Should they, after all of this, retreat? Venables, looking at his bedraggled, exhausted, terrified, and disease-ridden army, decided that retreat was the best course. The artillery pieces, which still hadn't found a position to bombard the fort, were destroyed, and they fell back to the river in a chaotic mess. And then it began to rain again, and even more soldiers came down with diarrhea. The fleet spotted them later that day. It hadn't been a full 2 weeks since Venables had landed on Hispaniola, and it had been an utter disaster. 2 days later, the commissioners and their officers agreed to abort the mission. This took time to prepare. For example, the fleet needed to stock up on water and make space for the returning soldiers. And it was a miserable time for the soldiers. They were running low on food, the fleet was holding provisions for the voyage, so they began slaughtering their horses. The Spanish were watching all the roads away from the beach and guarding any nearby plantations or villages. When foraging parties spotted some local cattle, they were so exhausted and desperate that they fired wildly and killed 16 of their own comrades. The soldiers were so jumpy that the clicking of crab claws in the night scared them awake. Some were so delirious from disease that they believed that the swarms of fireflies were the torches of Spanish soldiers come to kill them. Some deserted, defecting to the Spanish and claiming they'd always been supporters of the royalist cause, or secretly Catholic. And all the while, disease and exposure killed more men than the enemy. Adjutant General Jackson was court-martialed for cowardice, but unlike lower-ranked soldiers with fewer powerful friends, he wasn't hanged. He was cashiered, dishonourably discharged, and his sword broken over his head. As the departure got closer, the expedition was divided over whether to actually leave. The Navy, and some army officers, urged to try again. Winslow even came ashore to try and persuade the general. But Venables was convinced that this army simply could not conquer this island. The men were loaded onto the ships, and on the 4th of May they sailed away. The Spanish simply didn't believe it. They didn't believe they'd won. Even after the slaughter on the road to San Geronimo, the Commonwealth forces still vastly outnumbered the defenders by at least 10-1. But when the ships sailed away from the Rio Jaena, it wasn't a ruse. They weren't en route to another part of Hispaniola. They sailed south, and they weren't coming back. Exactly how many casualties the failed invasion suffered is hard to measure. There are wildly different numbers in both British and Spanish accounts. Venables would later insist that no more than 700 were killed, but critics of his command put the number much higher, closer to 2,000. In Spanish reports, the number grew larger, and the numbers of defenders fewer with each telling. It's perhaps appropriate that so much of the attack on Hispaniola was inspired, consciously or otherwise, by the adventures of Sir Francis Drake, because this debacle reminded me of another attempt to recreate the legends of Elizabethan buccaneering, the Duke of Buckingham's failed attack on Cadiz in 1625. But unlike the raid of Cadiz, the western design was not finished. As the fleet sailed away from Hispaniola, they were not bound for Britain to present themselves empty-handed to the Lord Protector, or to shelter in another English colony and drain their meagre resources further. They had sailed all this way for conquest, and so they now turned to an island which had not been seriously considered in previous plans. Next time, we will cover the invasion and conquest of Jamaica. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duchess of Devon, Michelle Gersich, the Marquis of Cheshire, Tim Mimmins, and the Earl of Dumbarton, Craig Connor. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can also access the ad-free feed through a membership there. Pax Britannica is part of the Airwave History Bundle. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.